Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to this podcast which is titled The Past of Cultural Studies, the Creative Industries. Oh, I'm being controversial there. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the second podcast in our series where we were discussing the future of cultural studies. As we talked about in that podcast, I've just been appointed the Dean of Graduate Research, but also the Professor of Cultural Studies. And my other half, the truly brilliant and, can I say, very handsome Professor Steve Redhead, is the Professor of Cultural Studies as well. So this is something we care about deeply and passionately. We are wanting to move forward in our job in Adelaide, but we needed to not only think about the future, we needed to go back to the past. And particularly considering the Australian context that we're in at the moment, we do really need to talk about the creative industries. There is one line of argument that one of the reasons that cultural studies has suffered so badly in Australia is because it became too entangled with a very reified, very poor rendering of the creative industries. We'll return back there in a second, but that's an argument for your consideration. And this is an historical conversation. It's also a warning discussion, I think, something for us to think about as a beacon of challenge about cultural studies in our present and our relationship with the political economy, our relationship with economic development, and our relationship with the cities and the places from which our knowledge emerges. And I particularly wanted to log an extraordinary book by a man I'm the biggest fan of. There are certain wonderful scholars. I follow their career and I've read every word they've ever written. And Robert Hewson is one of those great guys. I read him actually for my master's thesis on Beatles tourism in the early 90s. That's when I discovered his work. I love him that much. But in 2014, he wrote the book Cultural Capital, The Rise and Fall of Creative Britain. And I really recommend that book to you. I wrote, I think, 14 pages of notes from that book. It's so powerful. So I recommend that book to you. And that's provided, if you like, a framework for our conversation today. So it's my pleasure once more to welcome Steve, Professor Steve Redhead, to our conversation today. And Steve, let's go back, because obviously you were actually involved in the creative industries in the British modelling. You were actually involved in a lot of the actions and debates and discussions that Robert Hewson was having in this book. So let's go back to it. Creative industries was bigger than cultural studies, so there's plenty of creative industries that had nothing to do with cultural studies, but also cultural studies was and is bigger than the creative industries. So there's lots of cultural studies that doesn't involve the creative industries. But how do they overlap?
Yes, I think what happened is that they did become intertwined and couldn't separate themselves. And I think that's one of the problems with the history of both cultural studies and creative industries. I think you have to go back to the actual history of a tripartite development, which, in my view, is actually creative arts on the one hand,
yes,
cultural industries on the other, and then creative industries. So I think there is a tripart division here. Creative arts, which, if you like, could go back to the 30s in Britain, was still, and I think you're right, still very important in Australia.
Yeah.
Still very important in Britain. But you've got creative arts departments and courses, for example, in Australia, despite the overlapping development of cultural industries on the one hand, creative industries on the other. So creative arts is still a very important and powerful discourse, which cultural industries and creative industries have not been able to dislodge, either academically or in terms of policy. But I think what happened was that, certainly in Britain, and you're right, I was very much part of this, that the cultural industries of, say, the 1970s and 1980s, cultural industries approach, was eclipsed in the Blair years by creative industries. Creative industries as a phrase, actually, did develop out of the Blair government and out of an argument within the Treasury, actually, of the Blair government. But, for example, it was associated with particular individuals. And Chris Smith, who was the first Secretary of State for Culture in that Blair government, who I worked for, and also worked for Tony Banks, who was the Minister for Sport in that section, who came out of cultural industries with the GLC, for example. Those people were associated with that creative industries development, but it was seen to come out of cultural industries. Smith, for example, had a book called Creative Britain,
yes,
which, of course, Robert Hewson refers to, which was basically his early speeches as Secretary of State in that Blair government. And I did consultancy work for them, and then I was hired by Jeff Gallup, who was a friend of Blair's, to chair the Creative Industries Task Force for the state government of Western Australia in 2003 and 4. And I did a report for them. But also, it was clear by then that the creative industries flame was starting to wane.
Yes.
And you felt a pull back, particularly in Australia, to the idea of creative arts, never mind cultural industries.
Could I also just state in an intellectual moment that Chris Smith is incredibly important, because what's often forgotten is he held a doctorate. So he was
came out of social legal studies, in fact, which I did.
But also, didn't he have a PhD in Wordsworth?
I don't know about that, but he certainly had contributed, working in the sociology of law, for example, in an earlier phase. But he was, I think, a significant figure, not partly because he wasn't particularly interested in popular culture, but also because he did have a vision to develop, in the early days of the Blair government, a potential for an interesting creative industries perspective. I think that got lost as it became more free market, more neoliberal.
Because reading back on it, again, I wasn't there at the time, but I obviously taught the first Introduction to Creative Industries in Australia, first course in first year, with the wonderful Dr. Leanne McRae, Dr. Mike Kent, Dr. Debbie Hindley. All these wonderful people have gone on to great careers themselves. But it was a critical inflection where I would teach it almost as an evangelical creative industries model for the first 6 weeks, and then it would unfold back on itself and create a critique of the political economy.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that I'm not sure ever really made it into the Australian creative industries modelling was right at the start, Chris Smith focused on creative industries development in disempowered and declining areas. So right at the start, urban regeneration was linked with the creative industry. So intentionally going not only into Manchester, which was sort of doing okay at that point, but thinking about Stoke, thinking about Wolverhampton, thinking about the areas around Liverpool that could be developed. So is that accurate, or am I reading it backwards a little bit too coherently?
No, you're not. And it got lost. That got lost. And I think Hewson has provided a very good history of that, actually, in the decline and fall of Creative Britain. But what got lost in the post-Brown years was that if you like, any kind of aspect of radicalism and the links to political economy. For example, now in the UK, Manchester and other northern cities are called by George Osborne the Northern Powerhouse. My phrase for it is Northern Bauhaus, actually.
Funny.
Northern Powerhouse is regarded very cynically by those who live there. But the interesting thing is that it is a link back to that early, in some ways, a link back to the early stages of the Blair years, that Creative Britain is coming back as regenerative.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth having a look at that. But as I say, a lot of the radicalism has been lost.
There's a name we need to introduce at this early stage, thinking about that late 1990s period, which is so important, where a lot of this policy appeared to be written on the back of a fag packet, and suddenly the next day, there was a policy living and breathing on the streets of Manchester. But an important scholar, thinker, theorist of this time was Charles Leadbetter, who again I'm a big fan of, and he's important to this conversation with his work for Demos. We need to probably mention Demos if we can, and also the great book that I think was published in 1998, I think, Living on Thin Air. I think that book still stands up for what I used to teach as the small definition of creative industry. So he had a very tight definition that was about skill development, branding and design. If it had those 3 elements, that was creative industries. And certainly first year students loved that as an idea, and it held the project together, I think. Looking back on it now, what was Leadbetter's contribution here?
Yes, I think Leadbetter was important. He was an advisor, and he worked with people like Kate Oakley, who's now professor at Leeds University.
Respect to Kate.
Very important link, because people like Kate Oakley were able to develop this in a more radical way and a more academic way, interestingly enough. But I think what happened to the Leadbetter argument was that it became part of a theory of the knowledge economy.
Yes.
That was important. So to see creative industries as part of the knowledge economy was important. But once you lost the radicalism, once you lost the idea of the political economy, and in my view, really much more a part of organised politics, then you went into all sorts of different areas. I think one of the things that Ledbetter got sidetracked by was a kind of libertarianism, and his most recent policy work is on things like the Uberization of the economy, and that kind of almost self-help organisational development in the economy. He's always been interested in that kind of libertarianism, I think, and I think that's a dead end personally. But what was interesting about the kind of work that was done around the knowledge economy, Living on Thin Air is a very, very good example of it, was that it was moving away completely from the idea of the creative arts. So the creative industries on the lists of creative industries that Chris Smith and his department developed as early parts of the cultural mapping system actually meant that you could study a more general aspect of what was happening, certainly the British economy in post-industrialism. It was a knowledge economy which involved aspects of the virtual at a very early stage. And I think a lot of that's got lost. Creative industries in Australia isn't talked about in terms of the knowledge economy at all.
No, can I just say the one person who does is a dear friend of ours, Justin O'Connor's work, which we'll come
Very
back
different.
to, because obviously Justin was with Steve through all that time, with your great colleague Derek Wynn as well. We need to mention the late great Derek Wynn at this point. But Justin's engagement with the knowledge economy, the political economy, and the diversity of industries, I think, and Justin, you might disagree with me on this and we can have a scrag fight via email like we always do, but Justin, what I think one of your great contributions to international creative industries is you've helped us all understand the differentiation between the industries. Yeah. So Justin is magnificent in saying, well, actually, when you're talking about the money that CI is making, most of it's gaming team. So the difference between gaming and a local theatre, we need to understand that these are different modes of operation. And Justin was fantastic on saying, yes, creative industries, but they're very, very different sectors.
Yes, he's a very important scholar here, partly because he's in Australia, but also partly because he's resurrected, almost single-handedly, that cultural industries perspective. Yeah. He and Kate Oakley did a great book. A couple of years ago, Routledge Companion to Cultural Industries, and Cultural Industries was in the title, which I contributed to and was really pleased to do so. If people look at that book, that's an example of how the political economy, the radicalism can come back.
Yeah, and as I said, the key is I think Australia went wrong because they overgeneralised. Everything became a template, a checklist, just taking one city modelling and just whacking it somewhere else and hoping for the best. Yeah. And Justin was very methodical and surgical and stating very clearly, don't overlay stuff that has no connection with this other variable. He was very good on that. We're going to go to the guy that in some ways I hold responsible for losing years of my life. No, I'm joking. But let's talk about the guy that I hold responsible for dumbing down the creative industries. And his name is Richard Florida. So let's go back to the early 2000s. As we talked about, Charles Ledbetter was the late 90s and through Demos, and by the way, through his work on entrepreneurship in the mid-2000s. Yes. That was often some interesting work there, but I can understand your critique. But Florida really dominated the early 2000s, and he made a fortune in consultancies around the world. So Florida's ideas are really basic. The Bohemian Index, the Gay Index, do we even have to go back there? Oh my God. First-year students loved it, but first-year students don't run the world. So, Steve, why did Richard Florida's ideas at that particular period become so popular so quickly?
Well, I think partly it's very often the case, people are in the right place at the right time, and certainly Florida was. Yep. But he came from management consultancy. Yes. That's his academic and policy background. And the interesting thing is that got erased in most of the discussions of Florida. He does talk about post-GFC problems with this in the Great Recession book, which he wrote.
But much later.
But I think The issue is really to do with what academic discipline you're coming from. And this wasn't cultural studies, this was management consultancy. And that's where he really made the splash. And he was in it at an relatively early stage as well. So academically and in terms of publishing, he was able to clean up.
And also it had a bit of that self-help, believe and achieve crap in it. You know, it's like, woo! Because I mean, that's sort of the the management consultant stuff.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you had a real sense. If you see a lot of his seminars, a lot of which are on YouTube, he'd be going in and sort of riling up these group of businessmen or public policy, local government guys, and you'd sort of leave there, your heart is pumping a bit harder and you feel like you've had 15 espressos. So it's really believe and achieve self-help
so.
stuff.
And interestingly, it worked. As a guru, you know, for example, in Manchester, which is where I worked for a long time, and I worked with Tony Wilson, who was who ran the Hacienda and Factory Records, now deceased. Tony Wilson really bought into Florida in the mid-2000s. He was actually asked to write a creative industries document for Bay Cup and the surrounding area north of Manchester. And he said how important Florida was to these sorts of areas. He saw Florida really as a guru. Tony was always interested in academic ideas, but he kind of half got them, I think, sometimes. And that's a great example of it. It was Florida that he bought into rather than those really arguing for political economy.
But also, is it because it was so simple? You read those books and it really is, here is a checklist for regional development.
Yep, that's how he saw it.
And, you know, people often laugh about Florida, but actually if you read the books, this is not reified. He was sort of saying this, look, if Detroit can just get more gays and lesbians into the city region, then it's going to recover. And it's like, you just need sort of more urban, cool people drinking black coffee and you'll magically get regional development. I mean, it was like wizard stuff. It was like policy for wizards.
But we're moving to Adelaide, and they see it in those terms there.
Well, we'll get to Adelaide in a second. I'm not sure. Well, I think Australia is still in early 2000s Florida, to be frank with you, because it's easy. Yeah. It's easy, and it's about wizards. I mean, really, it's early 2000s, so it's like policy for wizards, and you don't need any money, you don't need any venture capital or anything. No. It's just, if you just get more gay people and drink more coffee, then, my God, you know, an innovative economy will emerge.
Yeah,
you know?
And I think that was true when I was Chair of Creative Industries for the Gallop government. You know, I tried to basically put forward the idea that you should adopt the Creative Industries Development Service, which basically was the Manchester example of Justin O'Connor and others, and the venture capital idea. They completely cut that out of what I was trying to suggest in the report. That's 2003-04. You know, we're still there.
Can I also tell the joke to listeners? Steve was probably too kind, or he's forgotten the joke, that his policy, his document that he wrote from that Gallup period...
Creative WA.
No, it was creative capital. You used the phrase and concept of creative capital. Now, for the Marxian listeners, and I know we have many Marxian listeners, you would be enjoying that creative capital. You can see the double edge. Needless to say, the creative arts wizards... completely missed the Marxian capital there and went all capital as in capital city.
They did.
The profound stupidity of some people in Western Australia. But still moving on. But let's go Antipodean, but let's not go to Perth and let's not go to Adelaide. Let's do some really interesting Antipodean work. And speaking of wizards, we're almost in Lord of the Rings turf, really.
Hello, Peter Jackson.
Hello, Peter Jackson. And you need to really direct that Doctor Who episode, Peter. Can I say, mate, don't tease us anymore. You get yourself there and you direct that episode. But let's talk Wellington. And particularly the former mayor of Wellington, Kerry Prendergast, an incredible person that you actually met and worked with her.
I did.
Her administrators
2007.
as well. Yeah. But she and the Wellington City Council basically grabbed Florida and they went, yep, rocking and rolling, working. And I also have a very personal interest in Wellington. I was there in 94 and 95. It was my first job. And can I say, Wellington was dead. It was the last place anybody ever wanted to go. Yeah. It was dead. It was a capital city. The pollies were there. The pollies left. There was nothing going on. And you go to Wellington now, and it is an exciting place. So you've got to say it sort of worked. So Kerry and Wellington City Council grabbed Florida and they ran with it, right? And then Florida was so excited to see his ideas work in Wellington that he opened one of his books with the Wellington case study, of course mentioning Wizards and Peter Jackson. So why Wellington, Steve? If you think of all the cities on planet Earth, Detroit, Osaka, all the places this stuff could be applied, next stop Antarctica, Wellington grabbed it. Why Wellington?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, because when I was working with Kerry Prendergast, and I also worked at the same time as 2007 with the New Zealand government, based in Wellington at the time.
Oh, Maharey.
Yes, Steve Maharey.
Yes.
And his advisors. It's quite interesting that it was both local and state. Yes. But I think what she told me then, was 2007, was that they had indeed fallen in love with Richard Florida, but at an earlier stage they had bought it hook, line and sinker, and when they tried to apply it, it didn't always work. And I think what they were particularly concerned with was getting the headquarters of major firms to Wellington rather than Auckland. I know that's simplifying it, but basically that was one of the major issues, and Florida didn't help with that. And in fact, they chucked Florida out. Yeah. And by the time I was working with them and trying to import the British ideas and trying to adopt some of those for both New Zealand government and for Wellington City Council, they had really moved away from him. So they had fallen out of love with him in quite a big way. It's difficult to say why in the first place. I suppose, again, the ideas were simple. They worked in other cities, particularly in the US, or as far as people were concerned, that was the case. And they fell in love with him. But the interesting thing is they fell out of love with him, and they didn't really adopt anybody else. And they started to become a lot more pragmatic when I was working with them.
Yeah, and I think also Wellington, why those ideas resonated so strongly, because it has a lot of relationships with San Francisco, not only because they're both on fault lines, but, they're very well educated, there's
Absolutely.
Universities there, it's a coffee drinking, posh, lots of magnificent bookshops.
Yep.
The Bohemian Index speaks to Wellington.
It was so blatant, yeah.
And so it did work. But what's significant is they actually used the phrase, they were in love with him.
They were.
It's emotional. It's not even intellectual, this commitment to creative industries. So we've gone to the Antipodean success story that Florida ended up saying, see my ideas work, look at Wellington. Whoever knew that. Let's now get to the astonishingly sad state of Australian creative industries. What a bloody mess. Firstly, Australia has ridiculously conservative arts establishments. They're just bonkers, that are blocking innovative policy from cultural industries and cultural policy. Then Queensland, particularly the Queensland universities, so higher education is deeply enmeshed in this story. The Queensland universities took on this reified Richard Florida, Charles Landry, I would argue also, modelling, denying complex theorisation of the political economy, denying social change, denying urban regional development, denying the tiering of cities, denying so much. And I actually did a job interview for a Queensland university, a professorship, about this period, about 2005, I think it was, Steve.
Yes.
And I got the job, but I didn't take it. But in the interview, they were talking creative industries. Went, yep, no worries, I've taught this. I taught the first creative industries course in Australia, yep. But I raised the fact that the Australian version of creative industries took perhaps the culture and the media bit from the British model, from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, but left out sport completely. Sport is not in the party at all. Left out tourism completely. And I would also argue, because of the ambivalent relationship with cultural industries, denied the glams, galleries, libraries, archives and museums. Yeah. So that was sort of parked on the side as well. So the panel agreed with me, and they nodded, and they went, oh yes, and they wrote those notes down, and they indeed offered me the job. But they completely ignored that advice I gave them, and those elements of what I would argue are part of the creative industries and would have worked best in Australia remain outside of the paradigm. So that's my vibe on it, Steve. What do you believe happened to CI in Australia?
Yes, I think we also have to go, to answer it, we have to go back to the British starting point. And when that was globalised, it was the Department of Culture, Media and Sport that we were talking about before, with Chris Smith as the first Secretary of State, and in fact the related Minister of Sport at the time, who was Tony Banks. And interestingly, Smith wasn't particularly interested in sport, even though his department was DCMS, Culture, Media and Sport.
Yes.
Sport always played an ambivalent relationship. And while Banks was there, he'd come from the GLC, he'd come from a cultural industries background and a leftist background. That reintroduced sport, but actually in the DCMS, in the last 15 years, sport has declined as part of that, interestingly.
Can I just do a footnote for listeners? In the year 2000, in fact, this was the document you worked on, Steve, Banks released that great A Sporting Future for All document,
which I did work on,
which is still available online, and you can actually see them desperately trying to create a sporting future for all. So this is important. So it's not about elite sport, it's about community regional development. You're with me, team? And so therefore it linked nicely with the rest of the project. But that was probably the key moment where the mesh worked.
It was. And Tony was actually, he was a real football fan. He was a Chelsea fan. But he was interested in the politics of this, of keeping sport as part of culture. In Australia, I think the trouble is that partly through the elite ways of conceptualising sport and culture, the two are separate. That, as you say, the creative arts establishment is very important and very, very established. But I think it's extremely difficult to get sport into that area. I found it incredibly difficult when I was chair of the Creative Industries Task Force for Jeff Gallup. Sport was incredibly difficult to insert into that paradigm.
And see, that's just cultural elitism. Do we just call a spade a shovel and go, right, because these people do theatre and those people over there play football and they're not the sort of people we like to mix with? I think it's as simple as that.
It didn't have the intertwining but also that it had in Britain. But also, I think it's partly because cultural studies kind of got lost. Cultural studies was intertwined to some extent through work at places like QUT. But I think that got lost as well as we started to lose the sort of cutting edge of cultural studies in Australia. We've done another podcast on this for listeners, but actually I think that's what's happened. In this period of so-called creative industries era, the last 15 years or so, cultural studies itself, which was intertwined in an interesting way at one stage, has actually almost been kicked to touch.
Yeah, because it's too clever and it's asking complicated questions. And if I can just give listeners an example of what's happened as creative industry has been decontextualised and removed from scholars, really, and gone into the hands again of management consultants. Yep. I did a keynote in Bathurst for a regional tourism. I think it was New South Wales Tourism Association, but it was based in regional New South Wales. So all these really tiny towns sent their mayors in their tourism offices and so forth. You know, Bathurst was large by comparison at 38,000 people. There were these little tiny places with 4,000 people. You know, basically everybody's married to everybody else type of place, trying to think about what does tourism, regional development and creative industries look like. So I was doing a keynote, and I think I was the 5th keynote of the day, looking at third-tier cities. So one of the areas I work in, Steve, you've done work in this area too, the really small cities, so and large towns. And so how do we create strategies through city modelling and city imaging that are specific to those places and bespoke, noting that the bulk of the literature is on second-tier cities like Manchester, Osaka, Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, or the global cities, so Paris, Madrid, London. And so that went fantastically well and brilliant. But the other keynotes that came before me were all people that had come from Sydney. Yep. So these were the management consultants, like the Richard Floridas, but a Sydney version. And these guys were looking at what happened in the Sydney Olympics in the year 2000, taking global city paradigms and sport, but in terms of an Olympics, and seeing how that applies to Wellington. And that's not Wellington in New Zealand, that's tiny little Wellington on the way to Dubbo, or Blaney, these really tiny places. And it was bonkers. And I remember all these people in the audience, these mayors of Cowra, who were sitting here looking at, well, you know, this is the strategy we used for the Sydney Olympics. And he's going, how remotely does that link to me? So the assumption, I think, is that what exists elsewhere, so in these global cities, can just magically be applied like a cookie cutter over the top of any other place. Do you think that's part of the problem here?
I think that's exactly the problem.
So how are we going to resolve that problem in Adelaide? Because there's been a little bit of juice, a little bit of energy about creative industries in Adelaide recently. Adelaide's a very interesting place, guys and gals. Big sporting capital. It's known as the home of events and festivals in Australia. Very strong universities in that city. A lot going for it. Having said that, it's got challenges with manufacturing. It was known as the place where a lot of car manufacturing took place in Australia. And of course, the car manufacturing industries, particularly in Australia, are declining. There's some shipbuilding there. But trying to get the balance between agriculture, so the Barossa for international listeners is there, so the big wine region of Australia is in Adelaide. So getting the balance between agriculture, manufacturing and the knowledge economy functioning is proving a bit of a challenge. But can this be a place, Steve, where new renderings of creative industries, if you want to talk about what the young people are doing, so Creative Industries 2.0, a new version of this, can this be summoned in Adelaide?
I think so, yes. I think it's ripe for that coordination, which I was trying to do in the when I chaired the Creative Industries Task Force in Perth, which is over a decade ago. And I think I wasn't successful in doing that for all sorts of reasons, but partly because there was still the attitude that economically you could dig a hole in the ground and get resources out of it. Even that, I think that it's not just manufacturing in general in South Australia that's a problem. Actually, across Australia, where the government at the moment, the coalition government, tells us that we're moving from an old economy to a new. I don't think they have any clue about how to do that, and I think on a small scale you could do that in a city like Adelaide in a very interesting way. This is the right time to do it. Right time to have
because
a new...
it's got sport as well.
I think so. And it's got a dynamic, that post-industrial dynamic, which we had in Manchester and which we developed, particularly through the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture, in a way that embraced economic development, but it embraced political economy and cultural studies. That's what you've got to do. You've got to coordinate all of those three things. And I think Adelaide's right for that.
I agree, but also what I think some very, very hard yakka has to be done in cultural studies in Australia.
It does.
First, because I think it's a very sick and very sad paradigm at the moment. It seems to me, guys, it's almost in two areas. There's sort of the living on fumes creative industry, so these guys coming out again and applying this template that has no relevance to anything at all and just applying that and hoping for the best and bringing in dough.
Yep.
I think there's that pseudo-entrepreneurial stuff, which of course is hurting us because they're not producing good results, to be frank. So there's that problem. And then basically cultural studies is back to that 80s doing some representational politics stuff.
Yep.
That's all we've got at the moment.
I think so.
We've got to flesh out the entirety of the paradigm. Last question, I think, and maybe this question is about not creative industries 2.0, but post-creative industries. And we haven't mentioned in this podcast, and we mention in every podcast, Steve, the global financial crisis, because no one else seems to care, but we really, really bloody care about this. So did the global financial crisis signal the end to the creative industries? Did the creative industries require that venture capital? Did it require a little bit of finance capitalism, real estate capitalism, the juice, the easy money that came from those modes of capitalism to fire the next thing? And once that easy money left, creative industries is in trouble?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that that's the case. And Florida, as a management consultant, recognised that in his book, The Great Recession, which came very quickly hot on the heels of the global financial crisis. He did. He self-critiqued really in that book to some extent, and I think that's about it. What has to be looked at is the way in which the new knowledge economy works with old aspects of the old political economy. Those are the most important things for cultural studies, actually. Not the idea of representation and identity politics, and not the quick fix policy, cultural policy stuff. I think there's got as you say, there's some hard thinking to be done, hard theoretical thinking to be done, but there's a lot of potential here.
I agree. And one area that I'm working on now, and again, maybe another podcast for us when we've resettled ourselves very comfortably in Adelaide, is, and I've been working on this phrase for 4 years, and I haven't quite got my hands or a handle on it yet, but education cities.
Yes,
and a lot of
very important.
And a lot of my third tier cities work, so these are the small cities, large towns, guys. I've focused on the importance of a university being in Stoke, so Staffs, for example, or Charles Sturt University, having a university in Dubbo and the importance of that. Central Queensland, having a university in Bundaberg. That's crucial. And in fact, it's the major employer, and you take the university away in these dark times, and there ain't much left, So education cities matters, I would argue, to cultural studies, because it brings back high-quality knowledge, higher education studies back into cultural studies, which might then trigger the creative industries. Is that a phrase to maybe hang the next stage on?
I do. It's a very important embryonic development, and you developed it, but I think it really is, it's almost a touchstone, and I certainly think that's going to be the case in Adelaide.
Well, Steve, good luck to us both. We wish all our colleagues and our hopefully new friends that we're going to make in Adelaide every success, and we're arriving and we are here to do good work. That's what we're interested in, and we're particularly interested in rebooting cultural studies and making sure that the universities and high quality knowledge, high quality theory is available to all sorts of entrepreneurs, public and private sector guys and gals who are thinking of going in new and innovative ways, and we're available to offer those opportunities to you, and we're available to buy you a cup of coffee, a posh espresso because it's Adelaide, and let's see if we can make this thing work, eh?
Yep.